most people think of infrastructure as a rather traditional form or a traditional definition, in the sense that it's heavy civil public works projects that we see around us every day, whether it's transit-related, roads, bridges, trains, commuter rail, subway systems, as well as environmental infrastructure, water and sewer, other forms of waste management, if you will, landfills. These are all relatively commonly thought of as infrastructure. Social infrastructure is a term that we've been focused on now for the last decade or so, and it really refers to the fact that a lot of infrastructure is really the built environment, if you will. This could be housing, it could be housing for the general population, or it could be for certain populations, such as students or potentially military families, when we looked at the military housing privatization initiative. On a broader basis, I think we've come to realize that infrastructure also includes the digital environment. And what do we really mean by that? It's not that well understood, but there's an enormous amount of infrastructure out there, from your simple telephone to, as we've now come to realize, much more complex forms of data transmission that allows us to communicate with video as well as audio on a global basis, and really, in effect, replace our face-to-face interaction. That backbone, if you will, of digital infrastructure, which also includes the wireless infrastructure that we rely on, is in the process of being expanded now into 5G, which will have enormous amounts of impact and change in terms of how we actually consider wireless infrastructure. So that I think is a relatively broad definition. I'm probably leaving out power or energy infrastructure, another form of infrastructure. I think we've come now to realize that infrastructure, as we think of it, has a soft side to it, perhaps. And soft infrastructure is really perhaps the services around some of the infrastructure, and whether it's operating systems such as airports or roads and bridges or power or environmental, those forms of services are critical. And one of the things we've seen, I think, in terms of how that the awareness of that form of infrastructure is that there's an enormous amount of capital chasing those services. At one point, we thought of infrastructure investment as a concession for a bridge or for a toll road or perhaps a high-speed rail system in a different country. Now we've realized that there are a plethora of companies out there that provide services that allow those companies, those projects to operate. And that is, when I think of infrastructure, I think of that as well. So as we think about the United States and the challenges that the U.S. is facing right now with respect to its infrastructure, many of us recognize that we were out in front of the rest of the world, if you will, with respect to developing infrastructure. And a lot of us would really think about the interstate highway system as a great example of how the United States, coming out of World War II, recognized for national security reasons and for other reasons that we needed to really bring the country together and connect the country, if you will. So that was a great example of how, at the federal level, the federal role was able to come into infrastructure in the United States and do an enormous amount of development that was quite needed and quite revolutionary. I think one of the things that the United States benefits from, but it also provides certain challenges, is that we have the most complex and highly developed form of municipal finance, from the tiniest fire district or school district all the way up to large multi-state authorities such as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey here in New York, where we're sitting right now. And so that provided, in effect, the buildup of that, the ability to, in effect, define credits across that spectrum and bring investors into that market on a tax advantage basis through tax-exempt financing or municipal bonds. That provides an enormous amount of capital. And in effect, it created its own infrastructure, if you will, of municipal authorities and systems and employees that provide and operate that infrastructure on an ongoing basis. The problem we have right now is that that form of financing is struggling to keep up with the upkeep and the continued development of that infrastructure for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with just simply the ability to raise revenue. Some have to do with perhaps the inability to maintain it over time and to be as cutting edge as we really need to be in terms of newer forms of infrastructure. So that, I think, is both, municipal finance is both a positive as well as perhaps a burden that we find. It also acts in some respects as a line in the sand or a bogey that we need to hit when we think of the cost of infrastructure, which has in some respects created a dialogue and a series of discussions over the last decade or so around whether or not the private sector can come in, as it has in other parts of the world, and provide infrastructure on an equally cost-effective and competitive basis. And one of the issues associated with that is that we get very caught up in the cost of financing. And I, as a banker, obviously very much am conscious of that. It is probably the wrong question for us to be asking, but that is one of the challenges that the United States has right now. When we think of all the capabilities of the private sector and the ability of the private sector to come in and help develop infrastruccture on a fixed price, date certain, turnkey basis, which is an enormous advantage to the public sector for all of the reasons associated with how those contracts are let, they're often compared from a cost perspective against a more traditional municipal approach where all of the risk transfer associated to the private sector doesn't happen, but the financing cost is lower. So we have a very complicated dialogue going on right now that provides an enormous challenge. And I think in some ways it's a bit of a hindrance, if you will, in terms of our ability to embrace projects and embrace new development. But at the same time, it also is the backbone of what has been paying for the capital side of our infrastructure for many, many years.